Welcome and thank you to everyone who is joining us in person or online. My name is Sam Brook, and I'm the Vice President of the Alexander Hamilton Society here at Dartmouth. This evening's discussion on the trajectory of U.S. China relations under the second Trump administration cannot be more timely. On behalf of the Alexander Hamilton Society and the Initiative for Global Security at the Dickey Center, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Randall Schriver. Mr. Schriver is chairman of the board of the Project 2049 Institute, a nonprofit research organization focused on security trends in Asia, and a partner at Pacific Solutions LLC. Since 2022, he has served as a commissioner on the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission, where he is currently vice chairman. He also lectures for the Stanford and Washington program and serves on the board of advisors of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA and the board of directors of the U.S. Taiwan Business Council. Previously, Mr. Schriver served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs in the first Trump administration, where he led a team of nearly 100 professionals and advised the Secretary of Defense on policy in the region. Moreover, Mr. Schriver was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs and held senior roles at both the State and Defense Departments prior, managing U.S. relations with China, Taiwan, and the broader region. He began his service as a naval intelligence officer during Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and later served in the Navy Reserves, including assignments with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and embassies in Beijing and Ulaanbaatar. Originally from Oregon, Mr. Schriver holds a BA in history from Williams College and an MA from Harvard University. He has received numerous military and civilian honors, including the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service. Mr. Schriver will be in conversation with Professor Benjamin Valentino, a professor of government and the Associate Dean for the Social Sciences here at Dartmouth. Professor Valentino's research and scholarship explore the causes and consequences of violent conflict, as well as U.S. foreign and security policy. He will moderate the discussion for around 40 minutes before turning to questions from the audience. Thank you again for joining us for this conversation that is both timely and quite important.
All right, well, thanks for those introductions. I'm really pleased to be here. As some of you might know, I'm filling in for my colleague, Jennifer Lind, who couldn't be here. Professor Lind is the real Asia expert, and I am not, but that maybe that's a good thing because I've got a lot of questions, and for me, they're real questions. I don't know the answer. If Professor Lind were here, she might have to ask a bunch of questions she already knew the answer to, but you could trust that my questions are genuine. And we're really lucky to have Randy here to talk about those. There are a few people who know the region as well as he does, so I expect you'll get some really interesting information tonight. Not only, again, about his views about the region, but obviously some insight into the current administration and how they might be thinking about those things. So I'm excited to start that conversation. Also excited because I heard you were teaching at Stanford and Washington, and I can say when I was an undergraduate, I was a student at Stanford and Washington. So I know that the building where the Stanford and Washington still is.
Yeah.
Okay. So to start, I'm going to start really big, and then we'll narrow in on some more specific questions. But the big question, which I think a lot of people still don't have their head around, and sometimes I think I don't have my head around it exactly, is just what is at stake in the U.S. China relationship? What is the core of our disagreements where we can't seem to get along? Why is it so hard for us to manage our differences? Why are we worried about where the relationship is going? And why do relations seem to be getting worse? And this is something that's happened over a long period of time, not under any one administration, predating even the first Trump administration by quite a while. Relations have been deteriorating for 2 decades. So tell us your view on what it is, what's the real bone of contention between these two countries?
No, well, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. Really Happy to be back here. I was last here for a college visit for my daughter, so I'm enjoying this beautiful campus on this beautiful day. And thank you, Professor, for jumping in and pinch hitting. So I think at the big picture level, there's a lot at stake. Look, these are the two largest economies in the world. Look at military spending, probably 1 and 2. We don't really fully know what China spends on its military, but it's very significant and growing. To nuclear weapons states, to permanent members of the UN Security Council, on and on and on. I mean, 2 of the most important and consequential countries in the world, which means that every problem is a little easier to address, if not solve, if we're cooperating. Every problem in the world is much more difficult and challenging if we're not getting along and not cooperating. And we've certainly had experiences with both, where we've had cooperation in the past that was successful by objective measures, agreements reached or situations settled. We've had diplomacy that was less successful. I think really what's put us on this trajectory that we're on now, and I think you were correct to say it's not new. And I always said in the first Trump administration, when people pointed to the more direct language about China being a strategic competitor and some of the sharper tools that were employed, I always said I thought the Trump administration was more evolutionary than revolutionary. You might remember the Obama administration, the pivot to Asia. We were going to have 60% of our naval forces in the region. We were going to invest more in partnerships and alliances in that region. And so I think it's a reflection of how we're responding to China's growing power, their stated ambitions, and how they're acting out and behaving in pursuit of those ambitions. And I think really to try to sort of bring it to the core issue, we have fundamental differences on what we aspire to see as the future security framework, future economic framework for the Indo-Pacific region and probably beyond. And it's in some ways, some of those differences may be irreconcilable or very difficult to reconcile. And so we're likely in a period of managed competition, hopefully benign, hopefully non-military, non-kinetic for probably as far as my eyes can see. But China, if you look at the trajectory that they've been on the last couple decades, they've had a remarkable growth story economically. They've begun to be a much more active participant in regional affairs and global affairs. We used to talk in the Bush administration 43, we wanted to draw China out. There was this feeling of, we need to bring them out into the region, put them at the table in regional fora, international fora, and they will see themselves as a responsible stakeholder. You remember that phrase? Well, sure enough, they have a seat at the table and are exercising their rights given that seat in ways that are in pursuit of interests that aren't always aligned with ours. And so I think the competition now is probably playing out most intensely in the Indo-Pacific region. And what we have is really the United States as a status quo power saying we want to preserve the free and open order that we and others have worked hard to build and create and now hopefully sustain. In a lot of ways, China wants to disrupt that. They want to disrupt that because they have sovereign claims that are quite expansive in the South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan. They have a preference for a regional order that is more deferential to its preferences. And so this is playing out in ways that I think make it difficult for us to have a more cooperative relationship. I think ideally what the administration would like to see is a relationship that is maybe the overriding characteristic is competition, and we're in a strong competitive posture, not only in our own right, but in concert with partners and allies, but one that still carves out areas of cooperation with China where our interests do align. And, we could tick off plenty, climate, energy, global health, et cetera. But I think for the Chinese, it's a little more difficult for them to compartmentalize that way. And the fact that we're so fundamentally at odds over something like Taiwan make it difficult for them to compartmentalize that and then be a good partner to us on some other issue that we care about. So we're feeling our way along through this competition, and I'm a big believer in taking the Chinese at their word. You mentioned my institute, Project 2049. The 2049 is reference to the centennial year of the People's Republic of China, and many of Xi Jinping's stated national objectives are tied to the year 2049. National rejuvenization by 2049, world-class military by 2049. So he's a great promoter of our brand at the Institute. But, if you take them at their word, they do have pretty significant ambitions, and they do, they want to see a diminished role for the United States. They are very critical of our remaining alliances and our forward deployed force posture. They're critical of our support for Taiwan. So they articulate a very different vision, and I think we should take them at their word, meet them where they are, and again, try to have a competitive posture, but one that still allows for cooperation where our interests align. And I think we muddle through for a while.
Let's get into some of these specifics about that relationship and the things that we're, we in China are not on the same page about. And the number one thing there is, what you mentioned, is Taiwan. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing a lot of Americans want to know is, why should Americans care about Taiwan? And,
sure.
And to the extent we have certain things in Taiwan, semiconductors or whatever, that we depend on them for. Why shouldn't our strategy be to minimize that dependence so that we don't have to care about a place like Taiwan, rather than, at least providing some strategic ambiguity about whether we might get into a nuclear war over a small island nation thousands of miles away from our shores?
Mm-hmm. I think it's an important question, because if you read our law, the Taiwan Relations Act, there are some security commitments included in that. It's not a treaty. People say treaty-like or maybe treaty-light, but there are security commitments there. We provide Taiwan with weapons for their own self-defense. That's a legal requirement. That's not a policy choice. Our law says you will provide Taiwan with weapons of a defensive character for sufficient self-defense.
Of course, we could change that. We could change that law.
We could change the law. It's been in place since 1979, and it is almost universally supported by Republicans and Democrats. But you're right. Or more likely,
there's not a core reason for us to defend Taiwan. We don't need a law that says we need to defend Taiwan, right? So the question is, what's driving that?
So let's get to that. So Taiwan is our 7th or 8th largest trading partner in the world. A lot of people are surprised by that. This is a place of 23 million people, comes in at number 7 or 8, ahead of India, ahead of Saudi Arabia. I would say number 8 counts. That's big.
Yep.
You mentioned the semiconductors. I think that story is probably very well known in this room. No need to go into great detail about it. But I think for Americans who are sort of vaguely aware that semiconductors exist, it's interesting that this small island, 23 million people, make about 90% of the cutting edge, most advanced chipsets. But it's really more than interesting, because this is a technology that's foundational to absolutely everything. Your car, your appliance, your computing, everything you do, there's semiconductors involved. So it's sort of beyond an interesting story. It makes Taiwan very critical in this sector and for global supply chains. But trade is not limited to semiconductors. So Taiwan is our 6th largest destination for U.S. agricultural products. Number 6 counts. Yeah. That's pretty big. I would say Taiwan is also a like-minded partner when it comes to a lot of regional and really even global goals. Taiwan is a very significant contributor to Ukrainian refugees in Poland. They're a very significant contributor to combating Ebola in Western Africa. And on and on and on, and you see these positions that they take and resources committed that really make for a good regional and global citizen in areas that we care about. I would say Taiwan as a very successful story of peaceful transition, democracy, and being now an exporter of that model of sorts. They have their version of NED. Well, we used to have NED. They're involved in democracy training and promotion. So they're now an exporter of that. But I would say, all of that being true, what is really quite significant about Taiwan is its geography. If we don't have a map, but if you looked at the Indo-Pacific, closed your eyes and kind of pointed to the center, you'd probably come pretty close to hitting Taiwan. It's really in the center of the Indo-Pacific. It is surrounded by key allies of the United States, Japan to the north, Philippines to the south. And it's no mistake that former Prime Minister Abe of Japan said Taiwan's security is our security. If you look at that map, the closest country to Taiwan is not China, it's actually Japan and the Southwest Island chain and Yonaguni Island, about 40 nautical miles away. So Japan, Philippines, others are really starting to see Taiwan's security as linked to their own well-being and their own security, even out to the second island chain. So if you think about the Oceania region and you think about Taiwan still has, of its remaining 12 diplomatic allies in the world, 12 is not big, 3 of them are in the Indo-Pacific. So they have the Marshall Islands, they have Palau, and they have Tuvalu, which when you're looking at contested spaces, Pacific Islands, second island chain is one of them, and Taiwan is a very significant contributor to those locations, being a formal diplomatic partner. So for all those reasons, Taiwan is important to me, and I think is increasingly understood in places like the Congress and in Washington. I do think we need to do a better job of telling this story in the greater United States. It would be a terrible thing if we were to enter into a conflict over Taiwan. The cost would be extraordinary, even if we prevail. So I think the case should be made before the fact. And frankly, I think that's part of deterrence, is our Chinese interlocutor seeing that we are communicating to the American public, we're building support for U.S.-Taiwan relations and Taiwan's continued existence. Because it's a very serious and significant thing to contemplate.
Tell us about China's view of Taiwan. As I'm sure you know, there are a variety of views on what China really thinks about Taiwan, with some people thinking this is primarily useful for kind of domestic propaganda purposes, to give the country something to focus on, and others who say, no, this really isn't just driven by political motives, but she is focused on materially returning Taiwan to Chinese control, within the next few decades. Where do you fall on that, and how do we know?
Well, I'm pretty careful when I'm asked to speak on behalf of Beijing's views, so I caveat everything with I base this on what we read in our research, but there certainly could be other views. So a big part of it is legacy and sort of the notion of unfinished business from the Civil War and legitimacy. So when the Civil War is concluding and the Kuomintang retreat to Taiwan and claimed to be the legitimate government of all of China, to this day, if you take them at their word in their constitution, that's a threat of a certain kind to China. It's a legitimacy issue, and it's a legacy issue, and they have maintained their position of sovereignty over Taiwan since the break, when the Kuomintang fled to Taiwan and moved the capital of the Republic of China to there. So they rather than over time have that interest diminished, attenuated, whatever, they've continued to double down, triple down on their sovereign rights. Part of that is also tied to other areas of China that have been named autonomous, semi-autonomous, that have some similar qualities to Taiwan, ethnic minorities, and complicated history. So Xinjiang, Tibet. If Taiwan were allowed to go its own way, what might the Uyghurs and the Tibetans think about their future? How would that impact how they would view the central government and the party? Part of it, I think, is strategic in the region. It is key geography. It is Taiwan is, in a lot of ways, a gateway to things in the Indo-Pacific that they care about. And then I think, sort of after all this comes this piece about what it means in the grander competition with the United States. They're likely not to back down while we're increasing our support for Taiwan. It becomes part of the broader fabric of competition in the region in that sense. So it's a strong historical legacy that it tends to be informed and reinforced by events as they've unfolded. And for a long time, Taiwan agreed with China that there was one China and Taiwan was a part of it, right? So Chiang Kai-shek flees to Taiwan, forms the capital of the Republic of China in Taiwan. They were Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek, bitter enemies. They have interesting family interrelationships, but bitter enemies, fought one another. Kuomintang forces, PLA fought and bled, bitter fights. But they could agree on one thing. Taiwan was a part of China, and it was all one China. It wasn't until the lifting of martial law in 1987 with Chiang Kai-shek's son, Chiang Jing-kuo, the rise of Li Dongwei, the rise of the DPP, where they started to explore this Taiwanese identity and this otherness, separateness from China that the Chinese saw a greater threat.
What do you think, if anything, is different about the Trump administration's view of the U.S. relationship with Taiwan than, say, the Biden administration's or even the first Trump administration's views about how to handle Taiwan?
I would say there's been remarkable consistency actually across administrations, and I think it's, again, reflecting the threat Taiwan faces and really the demand signal we've gotten from Taiwan for more robust security ties and enhanced trade. Taiwan has been pushing for a free trade agreement. So I think it's been pretty consistent. The one interesting kind of aberration is actually President Biden himself said not once, not twice, not three times, but 4 times, we will defend Taiwan if China attacks Taiwan, which didn't bother me, but it's a departure from long-standing policy.
Many other presidents have been willing to be on that
and
question.
So, and his National Security Council tried to walk him back and all that and said policy hadn't changed. But it was a clear departure. And President Trump has said, when asked, well, I would never publicly give you the answer to that question, which in the Trumpian way, he's sort of given a formula that's a reversion to historical position of strategic ambiguity. So I see mostly consistency. I think we may see more robust security assistance. So the first Trump term sold more arms to Taiwan in 4 years than any previous U.S. administration since the break of relations, including those that were 8 years, 2 terms. I would expect that to be ramped up again. There are some initiatives that some were started as far back as Obama, some Trump won, some Biden, that relate to our posture in the region with the Philippines, with Japan on the Southwest Island chain, some of the Pacific Islands that I think will be continued. So I think it's mostly consistent. And I mean, there's things that tariffing Taiwan, because everyone is getting tariffed, that's a change. But it's not necessarily a Taiwan-specific issue. Yeah.
Last question on Taiwan. You mentioned, and it's not a coincidence, that Taiwan donates a lot of money to Ukrainian refugees. Mm-hmm. And there's been a lot of talk about the implications of what's been going on in Ukraine for the China-Taiwan situation. And I think it's fair to say in the beginning, in the early days of the Russia-Ukraine war, the lessons looked bad for China in the sense that there was more unanimity and working together among the allies, the Western allies, to support Ukraine against Russia. And some people thought that might be an indication of a revitalization of Western alliances that might portend something in the case of dust up in the Pacific. And also, Ukraine performed better in its war with a much larger adversary than a lot of people suspected that it would. And so that also seemed to have some implications for Taiwan. Could its porcupine strategy, defend it from an invasion of a much larger neighbor? Of course, now it's not as clear what the implications are. Both because the Trump administration has backed away from this kind of full-throated support for Ukraine, and because Ukraine's fortunes on the battlefield have started to wane. The power of Russia's size has started to make itself felt more on the battlefield than it had in those early years, I guess, of the war. So what's your view about those kind of implications, both the political implications? Will America come to support an ally and or a friendly country? In fact, both countries are not officially allies in that way, although Taiwan's got more of a direct connection. And then just the more military question of have we learned something about the ability of a small state to defend itself against a larger neighbor?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've been at the Institute and at the China Commission been looking at lessons learned, but also specifically trying to look at what the Chinese themselves are writing. So what are the lessons that China's deriving? And Taiwan, what lessons are they deriving? And it's a range of things across that spectrum, as you said, political and diplomatic and military. One of the interesting ones that they've both taken away, so presumably that means they both will work on it in opposite directions with opposite force, but the key to leadership and continuity of government and sustainment of government. If Zelensky's on the first plane out of there, like Ashraf Ghani, the whole thing could have turned out differently, right? But he was, not only did he stay, he was on the airwaves, he was communicating to his people, he was communicating internationally. And so for Taiwan, continuity of government and communications, very key. But then China understands this as well, and they've been looking at decapitation strategies early in a conflict. The situations are different in terms of political status, Taiwan's standing in the world. These are not things that you would take to the UN. These are not things that you could have sort of normal coalitions form around because of Taiwan's isolated diplomatic status. And Taiwan has very different geography. So in the military sense, not easier, not harder necessarily, but different sets of challenges. You obviously can't resupply and support across a land border, but then again, that water border is a problem for China as it is for Taiwan. So things like the value of cheap attritable drones with very adaptable and flexible EW packages, all that stuff is being studied very hard. I think at the strategic level for China, they're kind of sorting through what does this mean about U.S. commitment and potential commitment of others. What does it mean that Vladimir Putin essentially threatened nuclear? This is your area of expertise, much more than mine, but that he essentially threatened nuclear weapons, and that seemed to have been a factor in keeping the United States out. The Chinese have written quite a bit about that in terms of, they have a no first use policy, but interestingly, it doesn't apply to Taiwan because it's their sovereign territory, and splitists would be not subject to that. So it's a very active discussion in all these places. I think on net for now, it gives the Chinese a bit of pause that Russia did run into so much trouble, that the international community did rally effectively, that even if Russia prevails, it's been a pretty costly campaign for them, certainly in terms of people lost, but the isolation, the economic cost imposition. Yes, China's a bigger economy. Yes, China's a more diverse economy, but nonetheless, they're seeing quite a bit of risk there. But the other thing is, it is a challenging target for the PLA. 80 nautical miles of water, mountainous, inhospitable terrain, very few ports for embarkation for amphibious forces, unfavorable sea conditions for most of the year, all for a military that hasn't seen combat since 1979. So they're getting better. They're training in more complex environments. But I think a lot of serious questions remain as to whether they would be ready today. Would they even be ready by 2027, which is Xi Jinping's stated goal?
Okay, now moving on to the other side of the relationship. We just talked a little bit about the military question, or at least one military question. But obviously, another big part of the relationship, as you mentioned already, is the economic relationship between the United States and China. And if you think we're already in a Cold War, or maybe it's just a chilly war with China, one thing that's really different about this Cold War compared to the Cold War we had with the Soviet Union is that back in the day, there were basically no significant economic ties between the United States and and Russia throughout the Cold War. And in some ways that simplified relations with them because those economic relations could be both a mechanism to keep peace. We get value out of them. We don't want to disrupt them entirely, but they're also a kind of cudgel that both sides can try to use over each other. And obviously, we're seeing that start to pick up now. There were tariffs against China in the first Trump administration. But again, as you said, evolution rather than revolution. Biden mostly kept those tariffs. Now Trump has increased them further, although we'll see exactly what that means. I'm curious what you think about the role of this economic relationship and your view here about the tariffs. Is that a good idea or a bad idea, or is there a better way to do it? And broadly, are our economic ties more likely to help keep us together, keep the peace, or might they actually be the thing that kind of drives us apart?
Yeah, so we have a very complicated economic relationship with China. We have huge volumes of trade, and that's kind of a hard thing to undo or undo quickly or precipitously. But we also have integrated trade when it comes to supply chains and when it comes to complex supply chains with global manufacturing that get down to component parts, critical minerals, rare earths, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the idea of people talk about decoupling, and then I think we modified that to de-risking. Decoupling is very, very hard. When we looked at this at the Department of Defense, we wanted to know, we thought we narrowed this to a very manageable, easy question, and a critical one. How much contribution from China is there in U.S. military weapon systems? That's something you might want to know, right? And when we started asking the question, the first round of responses from major defense contractors in the United States was, well, we don't know. Because they would lose visibility when you get to second tier, third tier suppliers.
You buy a component from South Korea, and you don't know how much of that was made in China.
Exactly. And so then our response was, okay, not good enough, go find out. And this process of mapping and getting down to critical component level, it's what you find is China's in all our weapon systems, basically. And changing that is difficult and costly. You have to develop new sources, you have to develop mining, you have to develop processing, and so on and so forth.
It could take a decade or more.
Pardon me?
It could take a decade or more to open up those kinds of new...
If you started now and sprinted, it could take a decade, yeah. I mean, rare earths is kind of the misnomer, right? They're not rare, it's just that they've managed to concentrate not only the mining, but the processing. In any event, so, I think this is a long way of saying we're kind of stuck with one another, but we're probably not in a good position with the status quo, and we need to do certain things. So I think very targeted strategic decoupling or de-risking is necessary. So that work that's going to take a decade, we should be on that and doing that. We should be working particularly with partners. Australia has a lot of the minerals. Partners in Southeast Asia are willing to do some of the processing. We can do both. We tend to, care about the environment and things like that. So we have to do things wisely and be good stewards and everything. But some amount of very targeted decoupling, I think, is necessary. I think number two, as long as we're in competition, as long as there's the potential for conflict, as long as China has very robust civil-military fusion program, which means they can divert anything from the civilian economy for military use. We should also be, in my view, strengthening export controls in critical sectors. We've done so in semiconductors. We probably need to be a little more aggressive on that, in my opinion. And we need to look at things like outbound investment. Makes no sense to me that we're going to say we're going to restrict Chinese investment in a U.S. entity because it's doing particular research and development of technology that has military applications, but But we're not going to restrict U.S. capital going to China, investing in the same kind of entity in China, doing the same R&D. So at our commission, we've recommended for years doing outbound investment review. And I think if you look at the investment security executive order of the Trump administration, they're going to try to do something like that. I think we need to look at other dependencies that aren't necessarily national security, but they're pretty darn important, like biopharma. Huge percentage of our pills, our medicine, is manufactured in China, both sourced at the critical element level and mineral level and produced in China. That's a dependency that I think could come back to haunt us in the event of a conflict. So
if that got cut off overnight, some people would die
absolutely
for lack of medications.
Yeah, and again, there are other sources and there are other ways of doing that, maybe with some additional cost, which is probably why we haven't done it. I mean, you go to the most hawkish members of the Congress, go to members of the Select Committee on China and tell them, we got this problem with our medicine and biopharma dependency, and they're like, yeah, we got to take care of that. Are you prepared for your seniors to pay more for their drugs in your district? Oh no, we can't do that. So it's a bit complicated there. But look, I think we want a trade relationship with China, for mutual benefit, and I think it's more of a right shaping than a radical reshaping of the trade and investment relationship. And in my view, there are some that would certainly be more radical.
Yeah, do you think the Trump administration would call it right shaping, or are they really looking for a much more radical reshaping?
So I think they're looking for maybe in between. Maybe I'll cheat and say I think they and here's why. So if you look at the tariffs, they're completely unreasonable levels, right? 145% tariffs, completely unreasonable. If you look at people in the Trump orbit, there are people who support this for different reasons. There's people who look at it as revenue generation. That would include the president. There are people that look at this as dealing with trade imbalances and trying to promote U.S. manufacturing and rebalance the trade through that mechanism. But there are also people that look at it as part of the competition and part of thwarting China's ability to continue to siphon out of its economy huge resources for military modernization and investment in key technologies. And they're doing quite well in space and AI and quantum. So there are some people who look at the tariffs as a way of starving them of capital and the ability to do that at more aggressive levels. And it's really that third category, that third group of people that I think wherever the dust settles with everything else, maybe we're going to get deals with South Korea and India, and we're going to basically settle into a place where we have 10% universal tariffs and then individual deals cut that essentially bring us down pretty low. I think China will be the outlier still. And I think there will be significant tariffs and constraints on the trade relationship with China. I think that is what is necessary for the time until we hopefully sort out some of our other differences. Because otherwise, I've seen 30 years of contributing to Chinese growth and military modernization in very direct ways that I don't think are appropriate for the situation we're in now.
Last question I have for you before we open it up. One of the reasons why Russia hurt so much after what it did in Ukraine was not just that the Western allies kind of banded together militarily to support Ukraine, but they were kind of a piece economically for the most part, with the exception of gas and oil, which was Russia's lifeline. If it didn't have that, I think the situation would look much more different. When we think about the situation with China, including actually when we just think about it from an economic perspective and what happens if we raise tariffs on China, as you said, much higher than we do on on other countries. The China's ability to withstand the economic pressure that we bring depends a lot on the strength of our alliances with others. If the United States is the only country that acts in a certain way towards China, but other countries remain open, even with high tariffs, China will ship their goods to those other countries. They'll slap a sticker on it and send it to us, and it's very hard, as you know, for us, as you already said, even in our military products, to figure out where stuff is coming from. So what is the state of our alliances with our Asian partners in particular? But I'd also be interested in your thought about our European allies as it regards China. How do they feel about this administration's strategy towards China? Is that tougher stance actually going to make it harder for us to cooperate with places like South Korea and Japan and Europe in the event that we need to apply pressure to China, or are they going to be on board with us?
So at a very general level, our Indo-Pacific allies have supported us standing up and being tougher on China. They are certainly less supportive and are concerned with our actions directed at them, tariffing them, or in some ways impacting them with cutting off aid, cutting off other kinds of programs, Radio Free Asia, the Fulbright, all this stuff that has really helped with our soft power and helped in these relationships.
And Trump has raised questions at various times about our alliances with other countries in
on burden sharing in particular. So they don't like being pressured to spend more on their own defense, although they're likely inclined to do so anyways, given what's happening with China, Russia, North Korea. And they don't like, particularly the South Koreans and the Japanese, where we have significant forces stationed, they don't like being bullied to pay more for what's called host nation support. The literal payments that they make in support of having U.S. forces on their territory. So in my view, we're sort of getting part of it right, and we're sacrificing opportunities on the other side of the ledger. So the part we're getting right, I think, is standing up a little tougher against China, but we're not bringing the allies and partners along sufficiently. I mean, at the end of the day, they're sufficiently concerned that they're going to continue to cooperate with us in significant ways. There may just be sacrifices on the margins that, the Philippines, will they let us do leave-behinds of significant military equipment after the Balakatan exercise? Well, pre all of this, maybe they would have. Post, maybe not. So it could be sort of marginal stuff that over time collectively is significant. Europe is also getting a little more complicated because it's not only the tariffs and the economics and threatening our Danish allies, which, as I said earlier today, and I'm going to repeat it here because some of us remember that the Danes sacrificed 43 of their citizens in Afghanistan on our behalf, coming to our defense when Article 5 was invoked. And so I find it outrageous that there are very senior people in our government calling them not a good ally. But I think it goes beyond the economics. It's this whole question of reducing our involvement and potentially our posture and the reprioritization of the Indo-Pacific. And, the conversations in Europe, there are some that are saying, well, we have to step up and do more for ourselves. And I don't think that's wrong, but I wish it were something that they arrived at on their own assessment of the threat environment and their own security needs rather than being sort of bullied and threatened into it, which I think will have some lasting impact. If there were to be conflict in the Indo-Pacific, we need the Europeans. Maybe not for hard power, and it would be unrealistic for much of a military contribution, but any kind of cost imposition, any kind of collective action to constrain China in a conflict, we would benefit from European cooperation, and I think we're putting that at risk. I saw over time, again, evolutionary, in the first Bush administration that I served in, Bush 43 in 2001, 2002, we were very far apart from Europe on China. I mean, they were the EU, the active debate at the time was the EU was going to lift the arms embargo on China that had been put in place after Tiananmen Square. And we sent delegations, and I traveled to Europe, and we said, please don't do this. And Chirac and Schrader were very determined, to lift the arms embargo. Well, they decided not to, and then over time, I think for a lot of reasons, they've become more and more concerned, and what I think really flipped the switch for them was China's backing of Russia in the conflict with Ukraine. That seemed to really set Europeans on a path where they were willing to do more with us in the Indo-Pacific and vis-a-vis China competition. So I think that's delicate enough that I don't want to see it put at risk, and I think we're doing that a bit.
I could ask you a bunch more questions, but I've used up my time, and I want to make sure we get some from the audience. So who wants to ask the first one? And don't say anything until you get a microphone so that folks watching online can hear what you have to say. Looks like we got a question right here. And introduce yourself, if you don't mind, before you ask your question.
Hi, I'm Pranav. I'm a 27. I guess you talked about how we know about some of China's goals for 2049. We have a bunch of China experts here in the U.S., including yourself. Yet there's so much disagreement on strategy. And I guess this is more of a general question about foreign policy in general. But when we make decisions, how complete is the information that we use to make those decisions? And how much do we really know, and where are the gaps?
Do you want to narrow, what type of decisions are you just talking about?
Just overall strategy.
Overall strategy. Well, I actually think the Chinese are more open and clear and explicit about their ambitions than some people want to actually give them credit for. China's opaque and they're an enigma, and well, if you actually read what they write and listen to what they say, that's our methodology at Project 2049. It's highly sophisticated methodology. We read what they write and we listen to what they say and watch what they do. They're actually pretty open about a lot of stuff. So, do we have perfect information? Of course not. And it's very hard to understand if there's, they're so tightly controlled with information going out. I don't even know that we would know if there was robust debate on a particular issue or not. But what comes out in terms of their strategic documents and important speeches gives a very clear vision of what they want the region to look like, what they want the relationship with the U.S. to look like, et cetera, et cetera. So I think at a strategic level, we have a pretty good foundation to base things on. What I would say where we sort of are now is growing consensus on the challenge and a belief that we have a sufficient understanding of China's ambitions, and then a great deal of discussion about what the right strategy, tools, mix of tools would be for the United States. Our relationship with China has always been a blend of engagement and hedging, and we're still engaging in some ways, but that balance of engaging and hedging is starting to shift more in the direction of hedging and what we call competition and a competitive posture. So those things are kind of debated and flushed out almost on a daily basis. Presumably this administration will produce a national security strategy, which the first Trump administration did, a national defense strategy. I oversaw an Indo-Pacific strategy for the Department of Defense. Right now all we have is an interim national defense strategy. And it's pretty strong on China, it's pretty strong on issues like Taiwan. Presumably the other strategic documents will come along, and through that process, that's where debate sort of gets aired out and where decisions get made. Now the documents themselves can read very sort of general 30,000-foot level language, but embedded in all of that is, and what informed that is a bunch of debate and discussion about what our policy should be. I would tell you that it's never easy or pretty. It's the sausage making, as they say. And I think in this administration in particular, there's going to be some pretty significant differences. There's a faction of people who have very strong views on China, and and it cuts across the DoD security world and into the trade and economic world. So Peter Navarro would be very comfortable in some of the DoD discussions about how we think about China and what we should be doing in response. But he's not the only voice. If you look at Lutnick at Commerce and Besson at Treasury, yes, they're supporting the tariffs because they have no alternative but to do so at this juncture. But behind the scenes, I think they're going to argue for a very different kind of relationship than, say, a Peter Navarro would. So that's the sausage making. That's what governments do. And at the end of the day, the president's the decider, and or not. I mean, we had a national security strategy that was absolutely wonderful in the first Trump administration, and then he, went in directions that nobody really anticipated. So,
who's next? Back here. Sorry. Try to let students go if students have questions. So.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, sir, for being here. So in the study of political economy, we generally recognize that competition between private corporations is a good thing. They usually produce good things for the consumers. So would you say we can extrapolate it to international political economy? Do you think there are any merits of China's competition with the U.S.? Do you think it's going to produce any positive effects for the international community?
I think from an economist perspective, it's not optimal, and the different ways this could spin out. There may be benefits to the United States on a security on a set of security issues, other diplomatic issues, but I think from an economic perspective, this is going to be suboptimal, and we're going to end up probably in sort of trading blocks, similar to, somewhat similar to what we saw in the Soviet U.S. Cold War competition. I think there will be a China-centric trading system with a set of rules and a set of relationships, and there will be a U.S. Japan sort of Western-led trading system. I think that's sort of how that plays out, and you can find efficiencies within that, but overall, it's not optimal, I think.
Go ahead. We can go down here.
Hi, my name is Wendell Smith. I'm a Dickey Center guy for 70 years now, and wonderful. Good subject. I missed the front end, but these two comments bring to my mind, we're so far beyond integrated economic systems, above, totally above. It isn't 10 years to change those rules. They will never, ever go back to tightly controlled trading between countries. The whole country that doesn't succeed itself is in deep trouble. And so the economic conditions exceed the political ones totally, as do the military, in my mind. Mm-hmm. And I'm walking through all different versions of this, and having done business in China, I tell you, they are terrific. And they're going to exceed us either way. In technology, apparently. So the other issue here is that the decimalization of our lives, digitization, changes it entirely to, we can't actually stop TikTok from doing whatever they want to do here. We cannot actually stop the Russians, if they wanted to, from turning off every single light bulb in this building tomorrow. We can't actually stop the generation of new ideas in AI by country or by color of race. So I would venture to say that what's my conclusion relative to these questions? Number one, industry and business is going so fast at solving these problems that that's where it's going to happen. And the cooperation by industries is totally intense. I mean, my own business in hydrogen, for instance, going to solve an incredible energy problem. incredible energy problem with a renewable resource that makes fresh water every day. And things like that are so much more powerful, meaningful than how do we handle the political action. You got to handle the political action, but I think the answer to where do you get your information to make decisions is by talking to the people in business that work there and have employees that are there.
Well, what do you think about this? Is it so that we're destined to be number two to China eventually economically? And okay, tell us why not.
I don't think so. Well, I think they have a ton of challenges. They're very, as you say, very talented.
By the way, I didn't say they win. Everybody wins.
Yeah.
I didn't say the Chinese that we won't stop them because we'll be sharing with them.
Yeah.
Got it.
All benefit.
Yeah. No, I think China has a number of very significant challenges that they're going to have difficulty overcoming, demographics probably being at the top of that list. I don't disagree with what you said about the degree to which cooperation is driving outcomes that are extraordinarily beneficial for all of us, and we would be pretty self-defeating if we tried to get in the way of that. But I do think, rather than you use the phrase stopping China from doing this or that, I think of it more as a competitive environment where we also want to run faster, we want to protect some crown jewels, we want to be able to maintain edges in certain areas, and I think those are worthwhile and achievable goals. I think there are certain things that we would want to thwart China's rapid advancement. I don't know how successful we'll be. I think the semiconductor story is a mixed one, but in some ways we've done pretty well, and not alone. We brought the Japanese and we brought the Netherlands along. I think historically we see a lot of instances where the power of connection through the private sector and people-to-people exchanges and all the wonderful academic exchanges can be overcome pretty quickly by some stupid political decisions. And we end up in warfare with countries that we were awfully close to economically in the past. So I think we should be, to me, these are not minor things to sort of navigate and just sort of stay out of the way of everybody else doing all the good work. These are pretty significant problems and challenges that we have to handle quite deftly.
Good. Now, let's get to some other students. Let's have a, thank you, sir. Let's bring the microphone over here. Yep, right up front.
Hi, I'm Elaine. I'm a junior here. So recently, Trump administration has been revoking a lot of international students' visa, and then a lot of them being Chinese. At least in my algorithm, my feed, I've been reading a lot of stories. So do you think Trump administration's immigration policy and its targets towards higher education would have an impact on U.S. China relationship, considering U.S. soft power or the cultural exchange, because China is a big source of U.S. immigrants and also international students?
Yeah, I'm very concerned about the direction of things, and I don't support the Trump administration's policies when it comes to these very draconian restrictions. I think there have been some issues in the past where some students have slipped through that probably shouldn't have when it comes to our security concerns and getting access to things they probably shouldn't have gotten access to, and probably came under false pretenses and had actual other affiliations that weren't declared and open. Those are problems you can try to deal with more with the scalpel than the sledgehammer, right? And we're taking a sledgehammer to it. I'm a big supporter of people-to-people exchanges with China. I've spent a great deal of time there myself and enjoy it and to derive some optimism from the fact that at a people-to-people level it can be quite a warm relationship, warm experiences, etc. And fundamentally we want a lot of the same things. So I'm concerned with the direction of things for sure.
Back here. Yep, there you go.
Hi, I'm Molly. I'm a senior. Let's say the U.S. is number one concern was containment. Like, in your opinion, what would be optimal policy for countering global influence with something like the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, well, as I said earlier today, you can't begrudge China for having a strategy. They have a strategy. And what you do is you beat it with a more attractive alternative. And in some cases, that's not just the U.S. alone. That's in cooperation with other countries that have similar views or of like mind when it comes to development assistance. And we've tried to initiate, for example, through the Quad, the India, U.S., Japan, Australia relationship, coordinated development assistance. That can be, that doesn't necessarily get you up to BRI numbers, but it gets you a lot closer. So,
you think it's likely we're going to do more of that?
No, I think we're going, again, I think we're heading in the wrong direction with the cutting of AID, cutting of MCC, Millennium Challenge Corporation. I do think we're going to preserve the DFC, the Development Finance Corporation, which is something that helps mobilize private sector resources, private sector capital. So, that's optimal to me, is we don't stop it because we can't, but we offer a better, more attractive alternative. My experience is we're more often than not the preferred source of development assistance and the preferred source of investment and capital. But we've got to be there with the alternative. Otherwise, there are needs, and China's very savvy to step in and provide these opportunities for recipient countries. There are certainly some instances where there's been buyer's remorse, and you've probably seen aspects of BRI described as predatory economics and debt trap diplomacy, and I think we can shine a light on some of that, and we have. And in some instances, there's been political consequences for that. Some instances, there was consequences and then flipped back. So in Sri Lanka, I think the Rajapaksas were thrown out for a lot of that activity and then brought back in. And the Maldives, a very similar dynamic where so-called debt trap diplomacy caused political problems for them at home. So shining a light on things like that and helping countries sort through, if we're not the alternative. We used to have State Department assistance programs that were legal assistance. Let's sort through this contract proposal and see what you're actually getting yourself into. Those kinds of things I think are valuable. So I'm a big proponent of being in the game and competing with strong alternatives, not necessarily just pointing a finger and criticizing China for what they're doing, because they're smart to be doing what they're doing.
Here you go. Right here. No, sorry.
Thank you. My name is Nelson, a sophomore here. I want to ask about nuclear weapons. So Bridge Colby argues that the U.S. should adopt an air-sea battle strategy to intervene that will do two things. One, strike dual-use ballistic missile bases, and two, strike C4 ISR systems. So in your opinion, how would U.S. mitigate the risk of escalation, especially nuclear escalation, without any meaningful emergency communication systems right now? Thank you.
Yeah, it's hard. I think, well, I shouldn't try to put words in Bridges' mouth. I've talked to him a lot about this over the years, and he and I are probably not exactly on the same sheet of music. I do think for most known contingencies in the Indo-Pacific from a military perspective, those are things you would want to hold at risk and prove that you have the capability to hold at risk for the purposes of deterrence, not because you're anxious to get into the fight. But it leaves unanswered the question that you just asked about escalation control, and particularly in an environment where we lack communications, crisis management. So it's one of the, Secretary Rumsfeld used to have this known knowns, known unknowns, unknown unknowns. This is a known unknown, is how we have what is an appropriate strategy for conventional contingencies and account for the escalation risks, and we just don't have that answer yet, as far as I know. So I think bringing China into that conversation on nuclear strategic capabilities is something we should explore. And well, I shouldn't say it that way. We've explored it for a long time, and our Chinese interlocutors have basically been very reluctant to have any kind of discussions that seem like they could lead to arms control or arms reductions or some sort of crisis management mechanism. But I think that's a piece of it. I think what they've seen from Russia, Ukraine, and as we said before, sort of the not so thinly veiled threat of Putin and how we responded to that have probably added even more risk here. So it's a good question, and it's something that requires more work from my point of view.
My name is Will. Thanks again for coming. My question was back on the topic of Taiwan and how we talked about, even though we have commitments to their security, we don't know exactly what a U.S. response might look like should China threaten them. My question is, whatever that response is, would we be acting alone, or to what degree would our allies like Japan, who you mentioned has a vested interest in Taiwan, help with that effort?
So I'd say a couple things about that. First of all, and I'm not accusing you of doing this, but a lot of people will say there's a binary, we're in or we're out to defend Taiwan. There's actually a pretty full spectrum of options that some are short of being kinetic, but would be very valuable to Taiwan: intelligence support, ISR support, and so on and so forth. So I think that applies to other countries too. And based on what they've said and based on the planning that I know to be going on, I think Japan would likely be committed. They see it as so critical to their own security. And at the end of the day, we've got about 48,000 troops in Japan, and I don't think I'm revealing any state secrets here. Those troops are involved in a Taiwan contingency, okay? I mean, that's, when you look at the tyranny of time and distance and what we have to do to get into the fight, Japan has to be involved, okay? Beyond that, I think it would be varying levels of support. For South Korea, it's very tough because they've got North Korea, and any effort to contribute to supporting the U.S. or Japan in a Taiwan contingency, they feel opens up the possibility that North Korea is going to be opportunistic and take advantage of that situation. So they're a little bit tied down, but there are certainly things that we may ask of them in terms of diversionary opportunities for air power and things of that nature. Other countries, it might come down to what are you willing to do to help run a blockade, or what are you willing to do to help with the battle space awareness piece. The Indo-Pacific, even just the inside the first island chain, is still a pretty vast area, and having a variety of capabilities dedicated to tracking and sensing, seeing, tracking what the Chinese are up to would be very helpful. So I'm giving this sort of longer answer about this spectrum because I do think we wouldn't be alone. I don't think we would get a lot of hard power support from many countries, but I think Japan is probably in, and I think we'd get other kinds of support that would be pretty important from other countries.
Here in the middle. And you guys can decide which of you seem like you're friends, so betting that you'll be all right, whoever.
My name is Maeve. Thank you again for being here. So looking back on the decision to admit China into the WTO, there was seemingly a great deal of optimism that China's increased buy-in in international institutions would kind of prevent the rise of China from being so competitive. But today we're kind of seeing that kind of go the other direction. So my first question is, what do you think about that decision to admit China into the WTO? And kind of secondarily, how do you see their increased economic incorporation relating to United States security concerns in the Indo-Pacific region?
Mm-hmm. So the history of my commission that I'm the vice chair of, we were created after the decision to grant China PNTR, which led to their membership to WTO. And the reason we were created is Congress every year used to debate most favored nation trading status for China. And it was a debate that aired everyone's concerns about China: human rights, political, diplomatic, security, everything sort of got folded into this debate. And when we gave them PNTR and entered into WTO, they created our commission to continue to give voice to those issues, look at those issues. post facto, post decision. Our commission 2 years ago recommended to Congress that we review the PNTR agreement. I forget, I think there's 22 elements in the bilateral U.S. China PNTR agreement, and determine which elements China's honoring, which they've not lived up to their commitments. And as a result of that, this last cycle, we recommended revoking PNTR as a commission. We've recommended that to Congress. Now, revoking PNTR doesn't necessarily mean everything explodes. It just means you're not constrained to this category of MFN and WTO rules, which, by the way, looks like we're not anyway. So, and we really saw it more as holding China to account. They made it. We were the critical partner in securing a bilateral agreement for their entry into WTO. They signed up for commitments. Again, I think it's 22, something like that, and they've basically failed on every one. So you could say we should have never let them in. I advocated for it at the time, and
Would you take it back?
Yeah, I would. Yeah. I think the notion that our engagement and our economic engagement was going to help liberalize, change China was a pretty naive one. But, 20/20 hindsight, right? That recommendation got a lot of interest in Congress. I don't know if they'll take it up. We have a pretty good track record of being on the leading edge where Congress will take something up we recommend, maybe not the year we do it, but second or third year. So I imagine they'll take a look at it and see what happens. But again, we seem to be acting in ways that are outside of international organizations that we're a member to and have signed up to commit to certain things. We seem to be acting in ways that are violating our own. I mean, President Trump is the one who renegotiated the UMC, the U.S. Mexico-Canada free trade deal, and now we're tariffing them at extraordinary levels. So this is all a little bit of, insider minutia at this point. I mean, we've got to kind of sort all this other big stuff that's going on right now, but I do think that's a direction that I would recommend.
Hi, my name is Isabel. I'm a freshman. Thank you again for coming to talk to us. In our international politics course, we were talking about how the U.S. isn't exactly allies with Taiwan in the same way that we are with Japan, and how we're just partners. I was wondering what you think are the possibilities of the U.S. becoming formal allies with Taiwan through a treaty or something like that, or if sort of the risks of escalation with regard to China are too great such that the U.S. wouldn't want to do that.
So I think the likelihood of a treaty and a formal alliance is close to zero. I think the possibility of strengthening our interpretation of existing law is quite high. So we don't have a treaty. What happened, we had a treaty that was signed in 1954, and in the process of normalization with China in December 15th, 1978, we said that as of January 1st, we were going to switch diplomatic relations from ROC Taiwan to PRC China. And in doing so, we also agreed to end our treaty and remove all U.S. forces from Taiwan as a part of that process. That was January 1st, 1979. That all went into effect. April 15th, 1979, the Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act because they were consulted on the switch of diplomatic relations, and they certainly were consulted on the parts of sacrificing our military relationship with China. And so within the Taiwan Relations Act, you have things that are treaty-like. So we are obliged by law to provide Taiwan with weapons of defensive character for their sufficient self-defense. So that is a legal requirement to provide them arms for their own defense. We are obliged to maintain the capacity to resist force if asked to do so by National Command Authority. That is a legal obligation. Indo-PACOM has to have a plan on the books, and it has to be credible to say we can defend Taiwan if asked to do so. That's not a commitment to defend Taiwan, political commitment, but it's a commitment to say we can do it if asked to do so. It says things like any threat to Taiwan, including economic embargo. It's actually in the, blockade. It's actually in the Taiwan Relations Act. that in the event of a blockade, it would be of grave concern to the United States and the security of the whole Western Pacific, and the president is obliged to report to Congress to come up with an appropriate response. So there's a lot of language in there that's pretty strong, but nothing is sort of that, Article 5-like commitment that you find in other treaties. So I think what's more likely, maybe you've heard of this discussion about strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity. So our policy has been strategic ambiguity, where we won't quite say whether we'll come to Taiwan's defense or not. That leaves the PRC thinking, well, maybe the U.S. will, and we better be careful. And that leaves Taiwan thinking, well, maybe they won't, and we better be careful on political adventurism and declaring de jure independence or something like that. But it sort of leaves us in this position of having no position. We're ambiguous. I think it's quite possible we could strengthen that in the direction of greater clarity of support for Taiwan. I think that's more likely than an actual treaty. Mm-hmm.
We have come to the end of our time, but I hope in this brief time, which went by very fast, it's reminded you that despite all the disagreements about exactly how we should manage the relationship with China, no one really who seriously looks at it doubts that it's the most important international relationship, not just for the United States, but probably for the entire planet for the next several decades. And so we would all do well to try to understand it a little better than we do. You're going to be hearing more about it one way or another. And I want to thank you for that reason, for joining us, giving us your take on this. And you're welcome back here to Dartmouth anytime.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you.